Hi guys, so today's video is going to be a non-spoiler book review for Vengeful by V.E. Schwab. Even if you haven't read the first one, no big deal because I'm not going to be spoiling the second or the first, so don't worry, I'm not going to get into specifics, but kind of giving a synopsis of the first one. This is essentially our world, but there are certain people that they end up dying and then they come back. And so when that happens, it's like in movies when somebody is in the hospital and then the monitor goes blank, but then they're able to kind of get their heart going again and then it jumps up. That's what I mean by they die and come back, not like zombies. When this happens, these particular individuals end up having powers, but this is kind of a phenomenon right now. It's a rumor, it's a myth, it's not something that everybody in society knows about, but the people that it has happened to. And our two main characters are people who are looking into this, trying to see if there's any validity in it, and they decide they're going to try to force this on themselves to see if they can gain powers. These two particular individuals are best friends, but when the story first starts out, you are seeing that they are arch enemies and that they really want to get back at one another, and you don't understand why. And the format of the book is a split timeline, but it's not just a split timeline of here's the past, here's the present. It's all over the place. So sometimes you'll get 5 years ago, sometimes you'll get 2 weeks ago, you'll get the night before. And it seems like it would be really disorienting and confusing. And for some people, maybe it's not going to be their thing. But I personally think it's done masterfully, and it makes it so that at the very end of both the first and the second, because the second is formatted in the same way, it makes the conclusion really satisfying and fast-paced, because some parts of the book can be a little slower. Sometimes the events in the past, they don't really feel like they're progressing the plot. It just kind of feels like character moments, but toward the end, everything is a race to the finish line. I'll admit it's been quite a while since I read the first book, so going into this one, I wasn't sure what I was going to be expecting. I remember enjoying the first one, but picking up the second one, I was unsure even what the plot was going to be, because I actually saw V.E. Schwab speak at a book signing, and she wasn't quite as huge as she is now. And at that time, Vengeful was not in existence. They hadn't rebranded the first book. And so she was saying how her plan was for this to be a trilogy. And the reason that I was surprised by that is because if you pick up the first book, it actually feels fairly self-contained. I think some people don't know that she always had the intention for there to be sequels, and there's a fear in reading what feels like a self-contained story and then seeing sequels that the author maybe just did it for a money grab, or like the publisher may have pushed the author into doing that. But I know that's not the case. And also, I feel that if you are the kind of person that actually appreciates a story that might have an overarching plot, but that feels self-contained within each book, you're going to get that with these. The reason I bring that up for the second one, I mentioned I didn't really know what the plot was going to be, is because the first one, it could kind of be read as a standalone, but I'm so glad that it wasn't for a number of reasons. One is that the powers that these characters end up having, the closest thing that I can compare it to would be X-Men. A lot of the characters have very interesting powers. None of them are the same in the slightest. And I found that there was one in particular in this book that it seemed like something I've seen before, but then it turned out to have this twist to it that was really cool. And the way that sometimes the characters that have these powers, if they find each other and they start to kind of interact with one another and ally with one another, the way they can make their powers work together is really cool and really creative. But if you are unfamiliar with either of these two books and you're thinking this is going to be some kind of superhero story where you have the good guy, the bad guy, that's not the case. There's definitely one character that I think you're rooting against, but that doesn't mean the character you're rooting for is a good guy. I won't even mention the characters' names because I think it's better to go in and not know who is the person that's supposed to be the good guy of the characters and who is supposed to be the bad one, because they're all pretty terrible. But I honestly feel like V.E. Schwab has managed to make some of the most compelling villainous type characters, because I found that none of these people were good people. None of them were, like, they did some things that you're like, what? Why are you doing that? No, don't do that. That's not good, that's bad. And then you're like, oh, but they don't care. And then I think that what's interesting about it is even though they are doing these things that are frustrating and upsetting and it makes them bad people, you kind of still are fascinated by them and you kind of still want them to succeed because they're just so interesting to follow. As for the writing itself, I haven't read V.E. Schwab in so long, and I think that V.E. Schwab is one of those authors who had so much hype, and then there was almost this push against it, and I read her kind of right before all the hype came about, and I remember liking her, and I felt like it was an untainted like because I didn't have the backlash or the hype contributing to how I felt. I just enjoyed everything I'd read by her. But coming back to her writing, I was kind of nervous because I was afraid, okay, well, one, it's been a while, so maybe my tastes have changed, or maybe turns out that she's not really as good as I thought. But coming back to it, she's not only as good as I thought, I think she's better than I remember, at least with this one. It was really good, and I actually think that it was really refreshing because this wasn't a short book. It wasn't, like a 1,000-page book or anything, but it was a thick enough book, and I consumed it so quickly. There's so many times that the writing just propels you forward, and she is really good at crafting paragraphs, I would say, because of the way that she's able to vary sentence structure, the way that she's able to have one paragraph be pretty elaborate, and then all of a sudden she has a paragraph that's just one line. And the way she writes everything, it just sort of forces you to keep going. And she has, in this particular story, a lot of short chapters, which is, I think, always going to be helpful in contributing to reading a book quicker because you're like, oh, I can read the next one. It's like 2 pages. I can read the next one. It's 4 pages. And as somebody who loves the fantasy genre, I just find sometimes, for myself personally, and I know I'm in the minority here, I feel slightly bogged down by extremely lush, kind of what feels like to me excessive description. Sometimes I just want us to get to the point. And this is true of books that I love too. So it's not like it breaks a book for me and I can't love it at all. But for this particular story, she is really good at kind of giving you a very short amount of information, and you feel already with that short amount of information like you completely understand the character and their dialogue, their mannerisms. It only enhances that particular description. And the way that she does kind of sum things up, it never feels to me like a cliche. And I suppose for some people, they might feel like there's not a ton of nuance to the characters because of the fact that sometimes we get these shorter chapters, sometimes we get more brief descriptions. But I personally think it was the exact right amount. One tiny complaint I guess I have is that every now and then, and it was pretty rare, but every now and then, some of the dialogue was a little like, he, I'm a villain. And that was just, in my opinion. There's one part where this character just kills a bunch of people that were sitting at a poker table, and after they kill all the people, they sit down and they're like, all right, well, deal me in. And there's obviously no one there, and it's like this kind of sassy thing. And that particular line or lines like that, they just don't usually work for me because I can't imagine somebody doing that, but it was very rare, and it only happened a handful of times. But it was something that, for me, a little bit, it went from having what felt like these really nuanced but very clear characters to being like tiny bit of caricatures. But not really. It really was just a very small amount. Also, I mentioned the split timeline that is throughout both the first and the second, how that might not be to everybody's liking, even though I personally really enjoyed it. There's one element of this that I think, for me, it was fine, but I do think might frustrate some people, and that's the fact that sometimes when we are getting moments that are a little bit further back in characters' pasts, it really does feel like something that, even though I already applauded the author for being succinct, I still think there were times that she could have been briefer, or she could have summed up one of the very short chapters and just had it incorporated into a different chapter. So one example would be there's a character who is kind of involved with the mob, and this particular character at one point ends up having a gun. And then we sort of go back and we see them learning how to shoot at a gun range and them being really precise. And I guess for me, it didn't bother me because I think you also got some character growth, not growth, but like you got to see inside the character a little bit more in that scene. And I love that kind of stuff. But at the same time, I was like, it's the person sort of involved with the mob. I kind of would expect them to know how to handle a weapon. That, again, I can only think of 2 times that there were moments that I was like, I don't know if I need to know this particular thing in depth. I think you could have probably just told me. And some people, though, I literally just said the opposite of what everyone says. Everyone says show, don't tell. And in this particular case, I'm like, I could have just been told, like, they had learned how to use a gun. While that only happened a couple of times for me, where it pretty much every other time that we went in the past, I liked it. But for some people, there are going to be times when I think it's going to frustrate the reader, especially if you're a plot-driven reader, because a lot of the times that we go back into characters' pasts, you end up really just learning about the character. It's not really anything to do with the plot closer to present day. Like I said, it's not just past and present, it's everywhere. But when you get way, way, way back in the past, some of that truly is just, here's some character work. Here's so that you have more insight into the character. And I love that. I especially love it if I find the characters fascinating, which I did in this story. But if you don't, I think it's going to drive you up a wall. One last thing that even somebody like myself who personally loves this sort of thing, even I occasionally was like, I think we could cut it down a little, is that not only do we have this really cool split timeline, we also have a lot of characters and a lot of perspectives, and it all kind of weaves together in a very cinematic way. This would make a fantastic TV show. But I do think that there was the occasional time when I'm like, I don't really need this person's point of view, and we still got it, and that was fine. But there were a lot of point of views. There were quite a few. So I think if you're somebody who prefers to have only a handful, or if you're already unsure about the whole split timeline thing, and on top of it, you're hearing that a lot of this is with varying different characters as well, it might be a bit more effort for you, or maybe it won't be to your liking. If it sounds interesting, though, I would still definitely recommend it because this was so good to me. Overall, I thought it was absolutely fantastic. Anyway, that is it for the non-spoiler book review for kind of both Vicious and Vengeful. If you are wanting to talk spoilers, I'll have a pinned comment in the comment section, and you can talk spoilers there. That way, if somebody doesn't want to be spoiled, you know, just avoid the pinned comment. I'll also have purchase links to these books down below as well if you're like, that sounds great, I want to check it out. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you guys later.